Yes.
Can we assume that the graphs that you have in these slideshows are the ones you want us to focus on? Or
Sure.
like studying? But there was like one or two other ones in the book that I like didn't really fully understand, but like,
They're gonna be the ones that I'm gonna talk about in class.
okay.
And I generally test you over things that I talk about in class.
When you usually upload the slides?
The slides that we might or might not get to today, but we'll definitely get to on Friday are already up. They're in today's date because that's what they're scheduled to have them
Okay.
have gotten to. So generally I'll try and have them up either shortly before or shortly after class. Today they're up before class. Because I'm recycling slides from having taught it 2 years ago. They're usually up and ready to go. I do change them somewhat depending on how I'm feeling about things. I made some changes to the ones that I uploaded this morning. Actually, it turns out. So. But,
And if we don't complete this, do you still want us to read that paper for Friday or not? The Arnold?
yes, we will definitely get to the paper from Arnold. It's a paper that reviews quantitative genetics.
Okay.
And regardless of how far we get today, my suspicion is that it's that material on Friday.
Okay.
Um, Oh, sometimes I will put up the student version that doesn't have the answers to the questions because, like when we were doing the atomic weight of things like that, I didn't have a student version and you guys were just reading off the answers on the slide. And after we finished going through that presentation, so right now you're operating off of the student version of the materials, and you're gonna see that on your version that you have available to you, some of the areas are blank that are filled in on the version that I'm using. And then after we've gone through that, I will then upload the full version for you. Yeah.
I have one more question about what we talked about, whenever our last class was. So, in the review that you asked us to read, it kind of gave you like Tim Bergen's 4 basic questions.
Oh, yeah.
And then on the slides, I didn't note it then, but now I know that it says like 4 answers to why questions, like Tim Bergen's 4 answers to why questions.
Yeah, it's just another way of
Is it,
phrasing
okay,
that, yeah.
it's basically the same thing, okay.
I'm going back to Tim Bergen's original paper. He referred to all of these things as, why would an organism be doing something? Well, there are 4 different reasons why they may be doing something.
Okay.
Other questions? You will note, or you should note, go and note. This morning when I got finished with my applied stats class, I sat down at my computer and I wrote a literature summary for the Joseph and Pinchot paper. You guys are gonna have to write literature summaries, and so that you have a model for what I'm looking for when I see a literature summary. I just sat down at my computer and wrote one. It's 2 pages. It's approximately a page and a half of summary and approximately a half page of critical thought. And so you can just click on this, there's a PDF of it, and see this is what a literature summary would look like if Paul had written it, and you can put the rubric to it, and you can see if I would pass. I would hope that I would pass. I did it, and the only thing that I looked at the original article for was to get the average number of eggs and the average number of fledglings, because there was something that I wanted to say in the results that required me to have those numbers. The rest of it, I just sat down and wrote on the basis of my memory of reading the paper and our discussion of the paper. So that's there for you to rely on to give you some idea of what I'm looking for in that. Yeah.
When we have to write those in the future,
Mm-hmm.
will we be turning them in like before discussion or after discussion?
My goal is to have you turn them in before discussion. Originally, the reason that we started doing these summaries was to make sure that everybody had read the paper and paid attention to the paper carefully before they read it. And so think of it as a preparation homework assignment. As juniors and seniors, you should be able to put quite a lot of critical thought into it, hopefully, as a result of that. The other thing is, if you're having trouble with the critical thought portion of it, you can always come and discuss it with me before the date. Once again, in all cases, if you're reading the article the night before and putting together the summary the morning of, then you're things that I'm happy about is it seems like a lot of you are getting early starts on things. Maybe it's because you don't have other things that are assigned in your classes or a variety of reasons, but it's nice to see you guys approaching the lab report, getting started on that early, et cetera, et cetera. Anything that you can do to get out in front of things is gonna be better. Because then, if you're stumped on the critical thought portion, for example, you can always come and say, I'm having trouble with this, and we can talk through that. All right. Other questions, issues? Next Tuesday is supposed to be a high of 27, which means at 7:45 in the morning, it's probably gonna be in the low teens or below 10. So keep your eyes out for an email Monday. If it's too cold to go out and stand around for an hour watching geese again, I'm just gonna rearrange the schedule. And there's this thing called the Hauling Disc experiment that we do that's scheduled for the week after that. I'll just move that up a week. So we will have lab next week. The question is just whether we're gonna go out and freeze our keisters off or whether we're gonna stay inside and do something.
Out of curiosity, what is too cold for you?
Yeah, 10's too cold. I mean, you're gonna be standing in place, looking through a pair of binoculars for about an hour.
What if you provided like hand warmers?
If I,
Like hand warmers?
no, that, I mean, cause you need feet warmers and everything else. I have really good cold weather gear because I bike in cold weather a lot. My assumption is that you probably don't have really good cold weather gear. And if you're standing outside in the wind at a lake for an hour in those temperatures, it's like, I could do that to you, and then you could sue the college when you get really, really sick, and I would rather not do that.
That was like the first, when you emailed us on the first day, I asked my mom, I was like, is this legal for him to like make me do this? I don't know.
I prefer to avoid litigation, but if it was gonna be an overnight low of 30, and then when we got out there at 7:45, it's 30, and in the time that we're there, it warms up a couple of degrees, we'd probably go. It's when it starts getting down into the low teens that I start to question the sanity of going out. And last week, it was much colder than that. It was like 4 at 7:45, and we're not gonna do that. I don't wanna do that even though I'm equipped to do that, and the last thing I need is you going to the hospital with frostbite because I was an asshole and need to go out in the really, really cold weather. Anyway.
I wouldn't see next meeting.
So, and I will try and send out an email to tell you whether to show up in lab, prepare to stay in lab, or prepare to go outside. All right. We were talking about lions because this is the example that your book uses to illustrate this idea that Tim Bergen has about, what are the causes for why animals behave certain ways. And in this particular case, lions engage in this behavior that we refer to as infanticide. When a new lion comes in, takes over a pride, the first thing that he does is he kills all of the babies. And so the observations here are that females are synchronous in their estrus, so they all come into reproductive period at the same time, and young die when new males take over the pride. So you can look at these observations and ask what are the causal relationships and what are the functional explanations for this. Well, you can have females come into estrus because of chemical cues from other females, so pheromonal cues which synchronize estrus in female lions, or this can be driven by takeover by males, which then the male gets rid of the offspring, the females no longer need to lactate, and then that brings on estrus. And the young can die either by spontaneous abortion, which is actually induced by pheromonal cues from other females that are also coming into estrus, or you can have young die simply because the male kills them. And so these are what we used to refer to in the old days as proximate causes, like what's the immediate cause. But the function that this particular thing serves, females going into synchronous estrus, is that you get better cub survival out of it. They survive better and have greater reproductive success when they leave the pride, because they get to leave the pride as a similarly aged group of young males they go off and take over their own pride, and then they get to breed in that pride that they have effectively taken over. The functional explanations for the young dying when new males take over is that the females will come into estrus more quickly, so the new male gets to sire a new group of young lions, but then also the male removes older cubs that would compete with his offspring for the resources of the pride. And so at two levels, there are explanations for this particular behavior. One of them is a very, very immediate cause sort of explanation. One of them is kind of a broader evolutionary cause as to why this sort of behavior would have evolved over time. And so this just is intended in your book to illustrate to you why thinking about these different explanations in these kind of separated little silos that Tim Bergen set up is a useful way of thinking about things. Questions? Yeah.
Would the functional explanations fall more into the adaptive advantage or function category,
Yes.
or the evolutionary history?
And that would be the adaptive advantage.
Okay.
Yep. Exactly. So when you hear people talk about Tim Bergen's 4 questions, they'll all use their own terminology for it. And depending on when you read people write about them, they'll use different language to describe them, and you have to do the same kind of translation that you just did. And I don't know why we can't just use Tim Bergen's original formulation and stick with that. All right, some review for you. Evolution via natural selection is one of the things that we're going to assume guides the evolution of behavior. Who can recall for me what the 4 preconditions are for evolution via natural selection to occur? Okay, so traits are heritable. Meaning that they are genetically based and can be passed from parents to offspring. Our heritability. Maybe I should just repeat what you actually said.
There's variation.
Okay, so traits are variable.
Competition.
What?
Competition.
Not competition, other things can drive selection other than competition.
More offspring produced than can survive.
And what else?
Traits that like lead to better survival or more likely to be passed on.
Okay. Well, let's do it this way. You mentioned survival. What else is important? Reproduction. If you produce more offspring than can survive, if those individuals possess variations, such that there's inter-individual variation, so this is all inter-individual variation, variation among individuals within a population. If those variations have a heritable basis, and if those variations lead to inter-individual differences in survival and or reproduction, then those variants that promote survival and promote higher reproduction will appear at a greater proportion in the next generation. Those variants that don't promote survival and reproduction will be represented at a lesser degree in the next generation of that population, and over time, the population will evolve. Now I've used a bunch of terms in all of that. I've talked about individuals, I've talked about populations, I've talked about generations, et cetera, et cetera. At what level does selection act? Selection acts on what?
Alleles, genes?
Okay, but those alleles and genes are possessed by who?
Individuals?
Hmm?
Population.
I'm not going for population. Selection.
Individual level?
Hmm?
The
Okay, so selection acts on the individual. So selection acts on an individual who possesses a particular variant, and that individual either survives or not, and reproduces or not. Over the course of time, though, the population evolves in response to selection that is being exerted on each of those individuals. So don't think of individuals evolving. You are not evolving in an evolutionary sense. You may be evolving in a social sense, you may be evolving in an intellectual sense, but you have all the traits you're ever gonna have. You are incapable of evolving. Now, you're capable of reproducing, and you can choose to reproduce or not. Traits that you possess may promote your reproduction or not. That is then selection acting on you. In some cases, selection being acted on you by the environment. In some cases, you're selecting for yourself what your reproductive destiny is. My reproductive destiny is I didn't want kids, so I didn't have kids. So my genes, whatever they're worth, they're gone. They're gone from the population after this. But I'm not evolving. I exist in a population that is evolving because the frequency of alleles that we see from one generation to the next generation are changing over time. That is what evolution is about. Now, is natural selection the only way in which we can evolve? Is natural selection the only way that that a population evolves? No. What are the other ways?
Mutation.
Mutations, so spontaneous changes in the genetic code. You can think of mutations in their pure form in that any change in the base in the genome results in a new form of that DNA, but as an evolutionary biologist, we would only pay attention to those mutations that resulted in phenotypic change. What's another way in which evolution can occur other than natural selection?
Genetic drift.
Genetic drift. Explain what that is to us.
I think it's when like an individual leaves like their population and goes somewhere else and then like recreates.
That is not genetic drift,
Oh.
that's something else.
Okay.
What is that? When an individual leaves one population and goes to another population.
Oh, migration.
Migration, there you go. Moving genes around from population to population. So somebody else tell me what drift is.
Is that like the catastrophe one? Like,
I don't normally think of it as catastrophe.
well,
There's barriers to reproduction.
No, that's vicariance, but that's a biogeographic idea. Because those barriers influence the rates of migration, so that would be a topic that you could think about in terms of migration.
Like within a confined population, in a closed area, like their genetics shifting to a different set based on what's being repopulated, I don't know. Within a small population, right?
So drift tends to be more prevalent and more noticeable in small populations, but you haven't done a good job yet of imagining what drift is. Have any of you guys seen the movie The World According to Garp? You guys should all watch The World According to Garp. It's a brilliant piece of filmmaking from a pretty good book, actually. Garp is played by Robin Williams. He's an author who's not succeeding, and you get insight into his writing process. And during the movie, he writes this movie about this guy who's in love with this woman, and he has these gloves, and the gloves are important because he plays the piano, et cetera, and somebody's walking along the sidewalk as this piano is being removed from their upper story New York apartment or whatever on a crane, as he's breaking up with his girlfriend or wife or whoever it is. I don't remember all the particulars, but the image that I remember is the vivid image of when the cable breaks, the piano plummets to the ground and kills this person walking along the sidewalk.
So when a natural disaster like that really
Now,
Just a random event. Yeah, it's just a random event.
it's a random event. Is there anything about that person's phenotype that would have prevented them from dying when a piano fell out of the sky on top of them? maybe if they had superhuman hearing, maybe if they had eyes on top of their heads rather than in front of their face. But of course, we don't have those variants because those things are things that are canalized in our development. Our eyes are on top of are on front of our face, not on the top of our head. It's a random event, and that random event weeded that person's genes out of that population. And it could have been anybody who happened to be walking down that sidewalk at that moment in time. It had nothing to do with that individual's genotype or phenotype. We put a word in front of genetic drift sometimes, don't we? What is it? Random genetic drift. This is the random removal of alleles from a population just through random death.
Is bottleneck.
So a bottleneck effect is when a population goes through a constriction in its population size. You experience a sudden population decline. Because you then reduce the population to a small number of individuals, the allele frequencies in that population are more likely to be different from the allele frequencies in the larger population. So bottlenecks can lead to the effects of drift being more prevalent, which is why small population sizes experience drift more severely than larger populations do. Do I want to say anything more about this? On Friday, we're going to explore each of these in more detail. I just want to get them in your head as we move forward. So these are three forces of evolutionary change. And the fourth one is, of course, selection. We oftentimes talk about natural selection, but natural selection is a complex thing. What's a variant of natural selection? We talked about it actually in the Joseph and Pinchot paper without actually naming it.
Like selection of mates or something.
Selection of mates. Sexual selection is a subset of natural selection, but it involves selection among individuals within a species, and the most prevalent of this is when individuals go and select mates, and you select a mate on the basis of a particular phenotype. And so sexual selection is selection that occurs when males compete with one another for access to territories that females use, or they actually compete directly for access to females themselves. And sexual selection occurs when females choose males because of some aspect of their phenotype. In this case, there's sexual selection going on in shrikes because the aspect of the male phenotype that the females pay attention to is cache size. And so if you have a bigger cache, the females choose you earlier in the season, you have more eggs laid, you have more fledglings fledged, et cetera, et cetera. Those alleles that those individuals possess that lead them to control territories that allow them to have bigger caches, then produce more offspring. Those variants then are on a higher proportion in the population in the next generation than the variants of those individuals that have smaller caches. Yada, yada, yada. This all sound familiar to you? Good. Genes are important. Just to give you a couple of examples, this is from a fruit fly study. There's a mutation in a gene that basically reduces the foraging activity. So when you track larval fruit flies on a petri dish, you can trace their paths and you can see how far they're moving per unit time. And you see that if you have this mutation, you have reduced foraging activity. Whereas if you have the variation of this gene that is the rover variation, they move further per unit time. As it turns out, if you basically insert a copy of a gene that codes for a protein kinase that is triggered by the presence of guanosine monophosphate, that recovers the foraging behavior because it upregulates the protein kinase that is involved in apparently controlling this particular behavior. So the idea that genes can control behavior is a crucial one. In this case, there are two variants of the rover gene, where you have the rover gene that is intact and where you have a rover gene that is inactivated. But when you add to that rover gene the protein kinase gene, it basically gives you more protein kinase activity, and that recovers this particular level of behavior. If you look at foraging behavior in bees, there are different types of bees, and different roles that bees play during their life in the hive. Young bees tend to be foragers. They're the ones that go out and forage. Nurse bees are older bees, and they shift their behavior over the course of their life such that when you get older, you stay behind at the colony and you nurse the offspring that are being produced by the queen. This is not in the book, Caleb, stop looking for it. This is stuff that's not there. So one of the things that you find is that when you look at the genes that are actually being expressed, it isn't that these individuals have different genes. There's not one class of bees that are foragers and another class of bees that are nurse bees. The same individual bees have different roles at different stages of their life.
That's actually in the book. It happens in the 3-week period, and sometimes the 1.
Oh, is it actually in the book? Maybe this is the
Yeah.
paper that is from the book. Okay, I went down.
Wait, you said the old ones do what and the young ones do what?
So you have old foragers and young nurses. Whoa,
And
I'm
then
sorry, I got it
the
wrong.
3-week age where
Old foragers, young nurses.
That's what- yeah.
That's it, okay.
Sometimes they go to the 1-week period.
It helps to have the second panel to tell you what the deal is. The cool thing about this whole thing, yes, Caleb?
In the book, it says that the young ones are the workers in the hive, not the older ones, because of that increased PhD activity on
He
the
just-
Yeah, that's what we just said. I corrected myself when I got the second panel up. Because it says young nurse, old forager, so having a figure to cue me in made me correct myself. The point is not whether it's young nurses and old foragers. The point is that what makes the difference between a forager and a nurse doesn't have anything to do with their genotype, because it's the same individual. When they're young, they're nurses. When they're old, they're foragers. These are RNA-seq graphs. Have you seen RNA-seq graphs before in classes? What is RNA-seq about?
gene expression.
Yeah, this is how we look at gene expression. So when you do an RNA-seq experiment, what you do is you don't isolate the DNA that is in cells, you isolate the RNA that is in cells. You use reverse transcriptase to convert that RNA into DNA because RNA is unstable and DNA is stable. And then you sequence those RNA sequences that have been converted to complementary DNA. And then that tells you what genes were either upregulated or downregulated. And when you look at gene expression between nurses and foragers, you can see that the gene expression in the two groups of organisms is totally different. So in this case, what determines behavior isn't, well, this person has a gene and this person over here has a different variety of that gene. These individuals have the same genes. They take on different roles at different times in their lives because the expression of those genes changes over time. Now behavior gets a lot more complicated than it used to be. Your book talks about group selection versus individual selection. What do we mean when we refer to group selection?
Doing it for the group, or, on the benefit of the entire group.
Behavior that is focused on increasing benefits to the group. So that's certainly a decent way of going about it. This was proposed by a guy named Wynne Edwards back in the 1950s and developed in the 1960s. This is a situation where selection acts to preserve the group, whether that group is a population or whether that group is a species. One of my biggest irritations with nature documentaries is so much of the commentary in nature documentaries is group selection as kind of commentary. Individual X is doing something to preserve the species or to forward the species, et cetera, and then my brain explodes. Because I'm like, stop saying group selection on these things that kids are going to watch and that high school students are going to watch, because you're putting forth a set of ideas that doesn't really have any traction. It's based in competition theory, because if individuals, for example, produce fewer offspring, that leaves more resources for the population or the species, and as a result, the species will be better off because it's regulating its own reproduction. So, because it's kind of premised on this idea of resource depletion. Everybody should not be like the Duggars, just pumping out as many babies as you can, because that's bad for the species. You can argue the Duggars are bad for the species for lots of other reasons, but a group selectionist mindset would argue for reducing reproduction because that preserves resources. What's the problem with this?
Individuals, oh, go ahead, Jack.
By reducing reproduction, you're decreasing the, like, ability of the genes to survive, say.
Explain that a little more.
If you can reproduce more, then you're gonna have a better chance of survival for the genes. If you have 10 versus 5.
So you as an individual, what would curtailing your own reproduction do?
Decrease the possibility that your genes can be passed on.
Okay, so it decreases the probability that your genes are passed on because you are purposefully curtailing your reproduction. Somebody define fitness for me. Something we covered in evolution and ecology. I realize that's a long time ago, but what is fitness?
To survive and reproduce.
Okay, so it's the ability to survive and reproduce, but how would we measure it typically? Number of offspring. Does anybody know how many offspring Dr. Reynolds has? Dr. Vora?
2.
3. Yeah, well, they're graduating and moving away, so it's hard to keep track of them now. Dr. Ron Lee?
1.
One recent one, cute as a button. Dr. Judd?
0.
Dr. Klawinski?
0.
Dr. Judd still has time. My time is running out. This is fitness in absolute terms. We ultimately define it in terms of how many offspring you produce. It's fitness at the individual level because Dr. Reynolds' genes are present in both of her children. Dr. Ron Lee's genes are present in her single child. So the number of copies of half of her genome are contained in those individuals. I have a fitness of 0, and my guess is it's going to stay that way. What's the fitness of the Duggar parents?
I think it's 19.
Last time I looked, it was 19. So we can define fitness in absolute terms. And in absolute terms, it looks like Bhupinder and Rose are killing it, and I'm sucking wind. But all of us are having our butts kicked by the Duggars, unfortunately, because we can also think of relative fitness in terms of what is your fitness relative to the most fit individual in the population, which I think maybe in the United States right now is that particular famous family. Fitness has nothing to do with what you think of the responsibility of doing that. Fitness has to do with how many copies of your genes are being put in the next generation. They're killing it, the rest of us are not doing so well.
So would Dr. Judd still have a fitness of 0 even though it's possible that he may have offspring?
Generally, we would define this as lifetime reproductive success, and so we would count this up after you've passed your reproductive period. So no, the jury is still out on Nathan. If he chooses to have children later in life, then his fitness will go up. I don't know what his plans are for kids. I think he's still trying to figure out his second year of being a professor. So lifetime reproductive success is generally how we would measure this out in the wild. You want to know, over the course of your lifetime, how many copies of your genes have you placed in the next generation? And that's always calibrated relative to the most productive individual in your particular population. In general, though, if an individual has a goal in an evolutionary sense, what will that goal be? put as many copies of your genes in the next generation as possible. If you have a gene as an individual that allows you to put more offspring into the next generation, and everybody else in your population is regulating their reproductive output, which genes are gonna get into the next generation? Which genes are gonna make a higher proportion of the next generation? The highly reproductive genes. So anybody who produces more than average, their genes are going to be in the next generation. And so selection is something that acts at the individual level, and any genes, any variants of the genes that cause you to reproduce more, those variants are gonna be the variants that are found in a greater proportion in the next generation. Evolution, in a sense, pushes us to maximize reproduction. Pushes us, pushes shrikes, pushes snails to maximize reproduction. So any individual that cheats, in this sense, any individual that puts out more than everybody else while everybody else is attempting to not put out new offspring, their genes will take over the population over time. And then you will have a population not of individuals who are holding back on reproduction, you will have a population of individuals who are reproducing at their maximum. Are there other arguments against this idea? We've already discussed. Generally, at what level do we expect selection to act? Do we expect it to act at a group level, or do we expect it to act at an individual level? It generally acts at an individual level. That's kind of the nature of selection. And all you have to do to demonstrate this to yourself is think of survival. We've been talking a lot, because of our discussion yesterday in lab, about predation. In predation, that is a very individualistic sort of event. There's a predator, there's you either survive the predatory attack or you don't survive the predatory attack. It's not something that happens at a group level. Now, think about nature documentaries that you have seen. Think of wildebeest on the plains of Africa. Have any of you ever seen a nature documentary with wildebeest on the plains of Africa? It's sad, it's so sad. Because what happens when wildebeest are roaming around the plains of Africa on their big migration?
Kill somebody.
They kill somebody?
Simba.
Oh, they kill Simba. They don't kill Simba. Simba didn't die. Simba came back and saved his planet.
The young get picked off?
The young and the weak get picked off. And so when you watch nature documentaries, next time you see a nature documentary that has a group of wildebeest, what you will see when a predator comes around, whether that's a lion or that's a band of hyenas or whatever it happens to be, you will see in many cases that the group of wildebeest will begin to circle. They get into a very stereotypical sort of flocking pattern that you actually see that occurs in wildebeest on the plains of Africa. It also occurs in many fish species that are schooling species. And it's actually been studied a lot in schooling species. And if you study fish in a tank, and this would probably be true of wildebeest on the plain, when those individuals start schooling, if you can follow individuals, what you will see is that they started out in a line, all going in a line, all together in their school. Then a big grouper or something comes over here and is heading towards them. They begin to turn away from the grouper. Why did they turn? The individuals on this side, the side nearest to the grouper, what are they trying to do? They're trying to move in to the group and put more of their fellow fish on the outside edge that is facing the grouper. They're putting more bodies between them and the grouper. As they do that, these individuals are now on the outside. What do? They do the same thing, and this whole thing starts to turn. as it starts to turn, it ends up being a circle. And if you follow individual fish, you see that it's all driven by the fish on the outside moving to the inside, placing fish that were on the inside on the outside, who then recognize they're on the outside and they don't want to be there because there's a big predatory fish over there, so they try to move to the inside. It's a group behavior, and it looks like a school of fish all moving in concerted, choreographed movement away from the predator, but it's actually a group movement that is driven by individual decisions. Selection doesn't act on groups, selection acts on individuals, and individuals act as if that is the case. And oftentimes when individuals act this way, what ends up happening and what we end up observing is coordinated group behavior. But in the age of being able to videotape things and watching the behavior of individuals in those groups, we see that each fish is after its own selfish ends. I want to put more fish between me and the grouper. I need to move into the group. Then you find yourself outside, I need to put more fish between me and the grouper. They move inside. Eventually, the ones that moved inside first, what happens to them?
Back on the outside.
They find themselves back on the outside, and then they want to move in. Coordinated group activity that is driven by individual selfish decision making. Group selection, generally speaking, does not work because everybody is going to pursue their own selfish ends when it comes to survival and or reproduction. Alexis, do you have a question?
But what about like, I mean, humans kind of do this, like think for the, I mean, some people, I guess, think like, you know, kind of.
This
like
is why I teach animal behavior and not psychology.
Right, of course, but like there's some like, I mean like, there's some species that are smart and like group-minded and might like, you know, be.
At the end of the semester, we're going to talk about altruism. Altruism is where you sacrifice your own fitness to promote the fitness of another individual. And so it is a topic that we talk about in animal behavior because there are a number of animals that are known to perform what appear to be altruistic acts. When you start looking at a group of fish avoiding a predator, it looks like this coordinated group event, but if you look at it more carefully, it's actually the selfish actions of a bunch of individuals. When you end up looking at altruism, behaviors that are reported to be altruism in detail, oftentimes you see that the altruism is actually one individual promoting the fitness of another individual, but in almost all those cases, it's an individual that they're related to. And so in the act of preserving that other individual and sacrificing your own fitness, you actually are also promoting your own fitness if those individuals also carry some of your genome in them. And so even when we look at altruistic events that occur out in natural populations, you oftentimes find that those are not very altruistic. Now, this says nothing about the passerby who sees a kid fall through the ice, goes and jumps in the icy water and gets the kid up onto the firm ice and then perishes in the process. That person has sacrificed his or her fitness for an individual that they're totally unrelated to. I don't know what drives that behavior. That is a type of behavior that kind of defies evolutionary logic, but you'll also notice that that behavior doesn't happen very often in humans. So I try and avoid getting too deep in the weeds with humans because humans are unusual in some ways. Humans make irrational decisions all the time, strangely enough. Yeah.
So like, kind of made me think, so like when you're on horseback and you're pushing a cow,
Oh yeah.
there's a lot of examples. So you're going and you have a herd and say that you're targeting one cow to get it to move in an area that you want.
Oh yeah.
And
You're
the
cutting
horse,
cow.
you're
Yeah.
cutting it, your horse is more agile than the cow, you're gonna get to where you want it to go. But the typical behavior of a cow in that scenario is not necessarily to go to the herd, but to run as far away as it can. So it's kind of like the opposite of how this is happening.
Once again, one of the things that I'm going to have you do after we observe geese, you're going to also go out and do observations. And the week after we do our goose observations, I'm going to have you observe an organism of your own choice. And one of the things that I'm going to ask you to do is it cannot be a domesticated animal.
Cause they behave differently.
They
Cats?
behave differently because they've been subject to artificial selection, whether that's unconscious selection or conscious selection. They've actually been subject to both over time. And so they also might not behave in ways that seem rational to us.
Even though in that situation it's kind of a wild, you know.
Well, they're not as wild as, for example, free-range longhorns or free-range horses,
Or like
Mustangs and things like that. So my question to you about that particular issue is, if you found a herd of free-range longhorns, would they behave the same way when confronted with a cowboy trying to cut them out of the
Probably
herd?
not, cause they haven't been trained to go and.
Probably not.
Yeah.
So I don't know that that's the answer, but if I guessed, my guess is,
That makes sense.
you would probably see different behavior in wild herds that are feral of domesticated organisms than you would see in domesticated organisms that are not wild.
Yeah. But I know Mustangs group together.
Mustangs group together a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
And you'll see that, so you guys, I have tons of movie references. Have you guys ever seen the movie The Man from Snowy River? Hmm? No? Oh, man, you guys need to watch more
I've never
movies.
even heard of these movies.
It's about these people in Australia, and they raise horses, and there are these wild horses in Australia called brumbies, and there's a lot of footage of wild horse herds being corralled by actual cowboys. They hired a ton of actual Australian cowboys who played the horse riders in this movie. And when you see these wild horses running around in the presence of these cowboys, they do the same exact kind of schooling behavior that you see in fish.
Yeah.
Now that I think of some wild horses that I've seen footage of. So. What else? All right, dismiss group selection. We're gonna look at some videos over the course of the semester, and occasionally those videos will have group selectionist language in them. Just gloss over that and pay attention to the images that we're seeing. So, natural selection acts in such a way that over time, individuals will possess variants of different genes that promote reproduction, reproductive success. So my question is, why do we not have superorganisms? What would, when I say the word superorganism, what am I thinking?
Superman.
Not Superman. I don't think Superman ever actually reproduces in the comic books or the movies.
So the one that reproduces, you're saying one that reproduces much more than the other organisms in the population?
So a superorganism would be an organism that produces more than anybody else in their population. Over time, that will come to dominate that population, and ultimately, that species would dominate everything, right? If selection is effective at doing its job, why do we not have a group of organisms that are just supremely capable of reproducing? What are some characteristics of the superorganism?
Is supremely capable of reproducing.
Supremely capable of reproducing. So if it reproduces how many offspring?
More than less.
How? What's the most prolific reproducer you can think of?
Right.
Oh, I can think of way more prolific things than that.
Fishes or something? I don't know how many it is.
Mosquitoes?
Way better than fish, way better than mosquitoes.
Bacteria?
Uh,
Oh, bacteria.
let's not, can we not talk about bacteria? This is an animal
Yeah,
behavior
I don't
class.
know bacteria.
Spiders.
Spiders produce a lot, certainly. The spider that I produced, that I worked on as a graduate student, produced 45 offspring. There was another species that I worked on in graduate school that had over 400 offspring. At one end of the extreme, what's a really low productivity species of animal? Elephants. Elephant is the classic example. How many offspring do they produce? One. How often?
Their gestation is 22 months.
Their gestation is hugely long, almost 2 years. It's like, I can't even
I
imagine.
can imagine carrying that size of an organism for 22 months.
Yeah, so they're really on the low end of reproductive capacity. So certainly insects are up there, they produce hundreds or sometimes thousands of offspring. But if big productivity in animals is in the thousands, why not millions? Or for that matter, billions. If natural selection is so good at driving populations to evolve higher and higher reproductive capacity, why do we not see these superorganisms?
Because if you have organisms with a specific genotype dominating a population, wouldn't it be the inbreeding? Doesn't that reduce?
Actually, inbreeding goes down the bigger the population you get.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, you remember that from genetics, yeah. Alexis?
Because there are trade-offs associated with producing more
Well,
offspring.
now you stole my thunder.
Sorry.
Because I don't get to go through all the other characteristics of a superorganism. So we talk about reproductive output. What would be another characteristic of a superorganism?
They can survive better than.
So they never die. They live forever. What else? When are humans capable of reproducing?
At puberty.
During your teens, typically, you go through a period of development before you're capable of reproducing. A superorganism, though, would be born or hatched.
Can reproduce right then they're hatched.
Can reproduce as soon as they're hatched. There is no organism on the planet that I know of that produces millions or billions of offspring, never dies, and is capable of reproducing as soon as they are hatched or born. And if you're producing millions of offspring, what is the size of those offspring going to probably be? Small generally, because you have a set amount of energy, but a superorganism would be free of that constraint of the size number trade-off. So it would produce billions of organisms, billions of offspring that are all very large, which would maximize their survival. But we don't see this. Why not, Alexis?
Because there are trade-offs associated with not only rearing the offspring, but also like actually literally producing and growing the offspring.
This idea of trade-offs is really prevalent in ecology. It is super prevalent in animal behavior. You can't have it all. You can't eat your cake and have it too. Example from the book, Paris Major in England. When you go out and observe the clutch size, how many offspring it is that you have, what you find is that there's a range of clutch sizes. If you give birds eggs, put other Paris Major eggs in the nest of a bird that already has eggs in its nest, it turns out that the peak fitness is slightly higher than the observed average clutch size, such that these birds are capable of fledging more offspring if they have more eggs to do it with, because when you put eggs, when you supplement a bird's nest with eggs that it didn't lay, it actually fledges more offspring. But when they do this, so within this context, when you have more eggs laid, those eggs are producing smaller young, so there's this size number trade-off. For every new egg that you produce, there's less energy put into that egg because you're dividing your energy stores over a larger number of boxes of energy that you're putting out there, these eggs. So this size number trade-off is common. And the more you weigh, the better off you survive. So this is survival after 3 months of the fledglings. The bigger you are, the higher your survival is. So these individuals, these offspring here, from smaller clutches that are as a result bigger, are surviving better than individuals that come from larger clutches and are thus smaller. So then the question is, why, if you have more eggs, is the peak fitness higher than the peak of clutch size? And the reason for this is when you just add an egg to a bird's nest, that female didn't have to produce the egg. And so in this figure, when they talk about free eggs, They basically laid their 4 or 5 eggs or 6 eggs or whatever it was, and then the researchers just added 2 eggs to it at the end of it. And in another set of bird nests, they took the eggs after they hatched and produced little baby birds, then they would add 2 chicks to the nest. But once again, the female didn't have to produce the eggs that produced those chicks, and she didn't spend any time incubating those eggs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why they're called free eggs and free chicks. But you can also induce birds, this is the evil thing about being a behaviorist, you can induce birds to produce more eggs by doing what? This is an example from the book.
They took them away.
When they lay the first couple of eggs, you take those eggs away, the birds come back, they see an empty nest, and so they keep laying eggs, and then you add their own eggs back after the fact. So now, rather than having 4 eggs, they have 6 eggs, but they produce all 6 of them. So those are what they call full cost eggs, and those require the energy input of the female to generate that higher clutch size. And what you find when you look at the fitness of the females relative to controls that they didn't do anything to, you find that the fitness is actually lower because they had to provision those eggs that got into the nest that were higher than they would normally produce. And then they also had to incubate and feed them, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's constraint, there are trade-offs. For every new egg that you produce, you're putting more of your own energy into the production of the egg, and you're also putting more investment into those offspring. You're spreading your resources across a larger number of offspring, and as a result, your offspring don't do as well.
Wait, didn't it, I thought like, no matter the condition, all of the offspring were, fledged.
I don't think so. I don't recall that.
Okay.
Nope. These guys had lower fledgling survival.
I don't remember if they touched on this in the book. Are they making sure that like these mothers have comparable numbers of eggs? So would they induce the mom to produce an additional 2 eggs and then consequently they would add 2 free eggs to another bird?
They didn't speak to that, I'd have to go back and read the original.
Couldn't that play a role in their results?
Sure, you've got a range of sizes here, and once again, we would assume that they added 2 eggs to individuals across this range. Alexis, you have something? You're going back and looking at the,
Yeah, that is what they found. The number of young produced who survived to breeding age did not differ between the 3 treatments, which was what allowed them to reject one of the 2 hypotheses and go with the other.
oh, so then, repeat that?
The results showed that the number of young produced who survived to breeding age recruits did not differ between the 3 treatments. And they had 2 hypotheses, and so it said, therefore, there was no support for the second hypothesis.
That was assuming that you made it to fledging.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that fitness isn't about the fitness of the offspring, that fitness is about the fitness of the female.
Right.
Yeah. When we talked about the caching in the shrikes, what did we notice about the number of eggs that were laid in the augmented versus control nest territories and the number of fledglings that came out of those? Do you guys recall? Hmm? Yeah, so the augmented nests produced 18 eggs but produced an average of 17 fledglings. The control nest produced only 9.7 eggs, so fewer eggs, but it also produced only 6 or so fledglings. So the rate of successful fledging was lower in those control territories than the ones that had the augmented caches. And as a result, so there's this idea that simply laying an egg doesn't guarantee your fitness. You have to get those fledglings to fledge. And ultimately, at that point, your input into your reproductive success is over. What happens to them after they fledge is kind of out of your control. Questions? downturn of this curve represents a trade-off. If you get too many offspring, your chances of those offspring surviving begins to go down. Therefore, there is an optimal clutch size that you have. In one case, you get an optimal clutch size that's slightly higher than the optimal clutch size that you observe because the clutch size is enhanced by the fact that these eggs and chicks are free versus not free, versus having costs. There are costs associated to reproduction, and those costs that are associated with reproduction hem in any individual's ability to produce more than they can. And so you don't get this because there are costs associated with doing this. Phenotypic plasticity. We generally define this as a genotype by environment interaction. I don't think we spend a lot of time in genetics class talking about phenotypic plasticity. But basically, if you have fruit flies and nematode worms and things like this are nice to look at things like phenotypic plasticity because it allows you to put a single genotype in lots of different environments. And phenotypic plasticity is a situation where when you put each of these lines as a single genotype, you put these single genotypes in different environments, and the expression of that genotype is affected by the environment that it happens to find itself in. And so that's why it's called a genotype by environment interaction. Single genotype expresses itself differently in different environments. This is illustrated in the book with a complicated study looking at, once again, birds in England. And what you see over time as a result of global warming is what's happening to the mean laying date. One is April 1st. Back in the 1960s, mean laying date was May, basically. And it's getting earlier and earlier. It's now 2 weeks earlier than it was back in the 1980s. So as the environment has warmed, the laying date has gotten earlier and earlier. This is a cumulative measure of warmth. How many warm days of particular temperature have there been? Cumulative sum, warmth sun, basically as it goes up, as the number of years go by, as we go from the 1960s to 2000, the temperature has basically gone up. The cumulative warmth over to this period of time during the year. So as the environment warms, laying date goes down. But what happens when you look at mean laying date and you correlate that with warmth sun, you find that the warmer it gets, the earlier the laying date gets. And also, when you look at the emergence of the caterpillars that these birds use to feed their offspring, like that caterpillar right there, as you look at how the environment is warming up, the date at which those caterpillars are available also appears to be earlier and earlier in the year. And so what has happened over time is that birds have responded to the changing environment because the changing environment has changed either their cues that they use for laying date, or it has changed the cues that affect the availability of caterpillars, and they're responding to the caterpillars. What does your book say that they also did with these birds when they looked at them? Because you can't tell if it's something happening with the cues of the birds, and then the caterpillars are also just tracking those same cues, or whether it's that, or is it that the birds are actually tracking the caterpillars?
Well, I know they compared the birds to other birds somewhere else.
They did, and what they found was what?
That those birds didn't show phenotypic plasticity.
They didn't, because they were at lower latitudes where the winters weren't as pronounced, and as a result, warm spring isn't as pronounced. And so, but that still doesn't rule out whether it's the cues or not. They looked at individuals that they had more than 3 years worth of records on, and what did they find? Because this could be just an evolutionary response to a change in climate. Those individuals that have the genes that cause them to breed early, get to breed early, they take advantage of the fact that there are a bunch of caterpillars out during that early time, they leave more offspring to the next generation because they get an earlier start on breeding, and so you have this evolutionary change of the birds evolving to just breed earlier in the year. Why is it useful to track birds that they have multiple years of data on?
Because then I can see differences between like individuals who are still living and not generational differences.
What do individuals not do from earlier?
Evolve.
They don't evolve. Individual one has all the same genes this year that it had the year before, and the year before that, and 10 years before that. So by looking at individual birds that they have multiple years of breeding, they could look at those birds and say, are those birds doing the same thing that the population as a whole? So when you look at individual birds, are individual birds also changing their date of first laying? If individual birds are changing their date of first laying, then that isn't a genetic change in the population, that's a behavioral change that is being brought about because of the changing environment. These individuals are changing their behavior, but they possess all of the genes. Whatever genes controlled the onset of behavior before are still controlling the onset of behavior now. They're just controlling that onset of breeding behavior in a different way because they find themselves in a different environment. This is what phenotypic plasticity is, and a lot of behavior is actually phenotypically plastic because one of the easiest ways to survive something is to have a flexible framework for responding to environmental challenges. And so a lot of the things that we look at in behavior aren't going to be things that are kind of genetically set in stone. There is a genotype that has a flexibility to it in terms of its expression that allows that genotype to express differently in different environments. And as we learn more and more about behavior, we learn that that thing happens more and more often. Yeah.
So was it the cues or was it the caterpillars?
They still don't know.
Okay.
All they know is that it's an evolution. It's not an evolutionary response, which means that it probably isn't as tied to the effect of the environment acting on the birds, weeding some birds out and allowing other birds to leave more offspring in the environment. It's a phenotypically plastic strategy such that if temperatures got colder again, they would make the laying date later. Now, it may be that they're actually just doing a really good job of tracking food availability, and the book wasn't altogether clear on what that was. But the fact that caterpillars and birds are both responding in the same way, it may be that all of them are just responding to the changing environmental cues. So this is the difference between the birds laying and the this is the difference in laying dates within individuals of birds, and they follow the same slope as the population as a whole. And they mention in the book that also the timing of caterpillar abundance and the timing of bird breeding is tracking very closely with one another as well. So maybe that they're all just responding to these environmental cues and they're all flexible in their ability to respond to this. Phenotypic plasticity is sometimes very difficult to get a handle on, and this is tracking vigorous, and as a result of it, they can determine that. Questions? We will talk about 4 forces of evolutionary change in some detail on Friday. We will also talk about evolution via natural selection, and specifically we're going to be talking about quantitative genetics and how we can use quantitative genetics to track evolution in populations over time. That's why the Arnold chapter is assigned, because that's a whole chapter about quantitative genetics. It also talks some about genotype by environment interaction.